Today is July 15th, 2016. Kay Wagner is talking with Dr. Bill Morgan, a retired internal medicine and infectious disease doctor. Dr. Morgan received his MD from Cornell University Medical School in 1956, and he joined Gundersen Health System in 1964 and retired in 1997, totaling 33 years of practice. Welcome, Dr. Morgan. We're pleased to have you here. G. Schautka is behind the camera, just for the record, and we will provide you with the DVD after the interview.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Kay. I'm pleased to be here. I thought in making some comments about my career, I would start way back at the time of transition. It had been, as you said, it had been 8 years between the time that Actually, yes, 8 years from the time I finished medical school till the time I started here. And those have been spent in first internship and then 2.5 years in the Army at an Army hospital in Germany, and then 4 more years of residency. And so I'd had plenty of time to think about what I wanted to do and where I wanted to be. And I'm very glad that I'd had that time in the Army. Had I gone directly from a couple of big medical centers where I took my training to my first practice opportunity, I might have very well tried to stay close to a big city and a big center, just because of the usual concern about the ability to keep up with advances and having well-informed colleagues around you and the excellence of care in a big center and all that. But I was lucky enough to practice in a small hospital in Germany, a station hospital, the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg. And I was lucky enough to practice there with Dr. Braley, Al Braley, who I'll say more about in a couple of minutes. But I found him to be not only a very good friend, but a very excellent internist and a recently trained cardiologist. We shared a floor together, a care of a floor of patients in Heidelberg. And at the same time, I met others of very high quality in the Army. And I began to realize you don't have to be at a great big city or a great big center to have the ability to practice excellent medicine with excellent people around you. So I think that made it very easy to take a serious look at lacrosse when Dr. Braley invited me to come out and see it. He finished his training a couple of years before I did, and so he was already here and had been here, and said, you know, he knew me and knew what I wanted, and he thought I should come and take a look, and I'm very glad I did, because not only his personality and the fleeting chance you get to meet people when you come, but also his assessment of the other physicians here in the 2 years that he'd been here was very high. He had high praise for them. I'm thinking in particular of the two Gundersen brothers that I knew first at that time, Sig Jr. and Adolf, who had both trained at a top hospital in Boston, and whom Al spoke very favorably of. So it was easy to come here, and I have never regretted it in the slightest. I might say that having a ski hill nearby was a factor. I did a lot of skiing in Europe when I was in the Army, and skiing has been a primary avocation of mine ever since. I skied every year until last winter. And so that's sort of the transition period. I suppose I could remark on the fact that I had more internal medicine training than would be normal these days. It was not uncommon in those days, though, to follow an internship with 3 years of internal medicine residency, which really makes 4 years. And then in my case, I took an additional year when I was invited out to Stanford as a co-chief resident. So I had lots of training. And that gives you also a sense of, how broad the field is and how important it is to be able to keep up in all areas. I had a feeling, an orientation toward wanting to be broadly based rather than specializing too much. And so I found this an ideal place with with about 3 dozen other physicians. You could sort of plug in wherever you were needed, and didn't have to be slotted into a restricted area of practice. So that's sort of how I got here. The main thing that I I've emphasized is my wish to be broad-based and to be with people that I felt had the same commitment that I've tried to have to excellence, and I found that here. I'd also thought I wanted to live near either in the Great Lakes or New England or Pacific Northwest, and the Great Lakes was just right. I arrived here about the same time as Ed Miner and Bob Green, Dr. Ed Miner and Dr. Bob Green, and I've always felt a special kinship to both. We got here the same month of August in 1964, and Ed was a good example of the ability to just plug in where you were needed. The institution needed an artificial kidney at that time, and I think it was maybe Bob Green, set that up. Even though neither of them had any advanced training in kidney disease, they were able to get that working, and then it was ready when very soon after that we got true renal specialists on the staff. So that's sort of the early times here.
Do you remember what number you were?
Well, I remember the number that I plugged in at, and it was 39, but I also learned that number had been used before. Oh. So I wasn't just the 39th in a row. You know, there'd been a few that come and gone, but it was in the range of 3 dozen doctors. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I was interested in keeping up with things, and I made a few trips to Rochester on my afternoons off because they would have a conference going on in Rochester. I'd drive up there after lunch and attend there and come back here. And I went to the normal conferences that any practicing physician might. There weren't many here at the clinic and hospital early on, but of course we've changed enormously since then, and there's conferences all the time now, I guess. But in those days it was a special event. I had something to do with setting those up because I was asked to chair the education committee, and that involved, planning and setting up the occasional conference, and it also involved being responsible for the new interns when they arrived during the short period between 1965 and 1967 when Dr. Ed Overholt arrived. And he went about the business of setting up a full residency. We just had interns before that. As far as the education practice, I want to mention that Dr. Braley and I took it on ourselves to issue a recommendation to the Department of Internal Medicine about a year after I got here. We were impressed at the difference between our own experience as interns and the experience that the interns who were here seemed to have. There were several interns the year I arrived, but the following year we just drew one, a young woman, and so there was plenty of room for innovation because obviously there was room to do that. And we thought that as we understood it, what had been practiced here was more or less for the practicing physician, the staff physician, to go take care of the patient with the young person, the intern, sort of at his side and taking notes and carrying out what they were supposed to do. And there wasn't a lot of opportunity, as we saw it, for that intern to take much responsibility for actual decision making. And so we thought, well, that's not the way it works in other centers. Maybe it could work differently here too. So we sat down one night at my home and put together a set of recommendations to have a so-called teaching unit, and aimed at the direction that I've spoken about. Dr. Bob Ramlow, who's I always considered a model physician, looked at it and he said, well, I guess you could call this a manifesto. And he said that I think his enthusiasm was slightly tempered by it being presented as a matter of fact that, of course, this is what we should do, but he went along with it. The idea was to have a senior physician take 2 interns sort of under his wing and assume overall responsibility for a restricted group of patients on a restricted part of the hospital floor, and call that a teaching unit, and try to give them real decision-making opportunities. And so I purposely kept myself out of it for one reason or another. But I got some of the best, the most senior people to do it. Dr. Rasmus was one, Dr. Perry was another, and so on. I think we had 4. I believe Dr. Miner did it, although I can't remember for sure now. But anyway, it succeeded, and it formed a nice bridge and a sort of a platform for the time when Dr. Overholt would come and try to build a true residency with that kind of responsibility diffused to the training areas. So that was part of the early years.
Because you were here a few years before Dr. Overholt came, isn't that correct? I think.
You know, my impression is he came in '87, but you might, or '67, I should have said, 1967. But I would have to be corrected on that, perhaps.
Well, if you started at 64 or 67, from my research, he arrived after you began your practice, so 67 would probably be just about right.
Yeah, he clearly came not too long after I did, but I can't stand by the year for sure. So as I alluded to early in our talk here, I think Dr. Braley played a big part in my arrival here, not only because we worked together, but because he had become close friends with Dr. Cam Gunderson back when they were both in medical school. And they remained close friends for the rest of their life. And Dr. Braley was invited to come here because Dr. Cam Gunderson asked him to do that and persuaded him it would be a good idea. So it was a sort of a chain event through my eyes. Cam Gunderson asked Al Braley to come, and Al Braley then later asked me to come. And I became good friends with both of them, and I'm still a close friend of Al Braley's. As you probably know, Cam Gunderson has come on hard times with his memory. The early times here, I tried early on to carry over some residency habits from the centers that I'd trained at, like looking at any routine blood smears from my own patients and reading my own electrocardiograms and so on. Some of that fell by the wayside just because of time pressure, but I did make an effort to carry on with the atmosphere that I'd trained in, and it's hard to even think about the early days without realizing the enormous changes that have been made, because when I first started here, there weren't any such things as CT scans, let alone MRIs. I can still remember going to my the first time that I ever saw an ultrasound. I attended a cardiology meeting in New Jersey, in Atlantic City, and suddenly there was this new modality, and all the booths had little ultrasound screens and people demonstrating how to show a heart. That was all well after I was established here. And of course, ultrasounds and CT scans are sort of old news long ago. I have a couple of quotes that stayed with me. I don't know whether we ought to get to those yet, but at some point here, I suppose you may ask me if I have any recommendations for other people or thoughts, and so I'll pass on that for the moment, maybe, and come back to that. Another feature of my early years at Gunderson Clinic was the chance to plug in and attend with Thorolf Gunderson, a senior internist, at the local Onalaska tuberculosis sanatorium, which was housed jointly with a nursing home. So both of us attended up there. We'd go up. I can't now remember whether we went more than once a week, but we may very well have gone 2 or 3 times a week. And as well as attending to the nursing home, we would hold a clinic for recovered tuberculosis patients who would come in and get a chest X-ray, and we'd read those chest X-rays. And then we would attend to the inpatients, the long-term patients. In those days, it was very long-term. There was a family that was there for about a year. The care of tuberculosis changed dramatically within the first 5 or 8 years or so of my time here also, so that sanatoria disappeared and patients were treated as outpatients after a very short time in the hospital, a matter of days. And then infectious diseases was the subspecialty that I practiced. I was never formally trained in infectious diseases. I made a point of being able to spend 3 months on an infectious disease service in one of my years of residency, when I had divided it up between neurology and cardiology and infectious diseases. And then I tried to focus on it as a chief resident. And when I came here, because I was the only one who was interested in assuming the mantle of the infectious disease guy. But as I say, I wasn't formally trained, and I had to work extra hard to try to keep up with it. When Jim Glasser and then later Bill Agger came, they were both formally trained, and I was blessed to have them as colleagues. They didn't hesitate at all to welcome me as an equal, even though their training was formal and mine wasn't. And the three of us, for the next umpteen years, acted as colleagues on an infectious disease service, splitting it for 4 months at a time, and managing both inpatients and largely consultations. There's not a lot of outpatient care except for patients with intravenous access problems, but there was always plenty of consultative work, particularly in orthopedics and other areas as well. That also gave me and them an opportunity to see other specialties in action that we would never see professionally otherwise. But being called to see an eye infection by an ophthalmologist was an experience. You had to go learn a lot to do that, and so it drove you to the library and to other sources. So trying to stay broad-based was a part of it, as I mentioned. I tried to stay broad-based in the sense of staying on as an emergency ward volunteer. That was rooted in my first full year here because we didn't have interns that year, and everyone took turns in the emergency ward. I think all the doctors did. I wouldn't want to be held to that for some of the subspecialists, but I think all of us did. And so there came a time later when the emergency room began to be staffed by only full-time people. That didn't happen overnight, and some of us stayed on and continued to try to do that even at that point. So I tried to do that, and then one night an intoxicated guy came in with a lacerated eyelid, and I found myself trying to sew up an eyelid and wondering what in the world I was doing in an emergency room as an internist who'd been away from any type of medical school surgery for much too long. So that was the end of that particular type of volunteering. So Kay, so far, do you have any questions at all, Kay?
Well, I was going to go back to, I'd like to go back and ask you to talk about your upbringing and what you grew up in Delaware.
Yeah.
And just talk about your family and parents and siblings and.
Okay.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah, I was the oldest of three sons. My father was a chemist at the DuPont Company. He'd moved from the South as a young man. He was born in Georgia. He grew up in Georgia. I misspoke. He grew up in Georgia, and he went to Georgia Tech as a chemical engineer, and then to the University of Pittsburgh as for his master's degree, and then he went to the DuPont Company, and he was able to hold a job all through the Depression, which was a big thing because I was born in 1931, and that was important. We spent some early years in downstate Delaware, where my grandmother had been widowed, and we moved in with her for a couple of years or so, and then moved later to Claymont, Delaware, which is north of Wilmington and is a little farther away than a suburb, but close enough to be allied with Wilmington. That's where I went to high school. We had about 60 in our class, and I had my two siblings. One, my brother Dick, was born 4.5 years after me, and Don was born 9 years later, and we've remained close through the years. Both of them became internists, and both have retired after successful careers. My mother grew up on a farm, and she remained a mother and at home, and an important mother. The my own path into medicine was not a very predictable one. I grew up knowing I was going to be a chemist, and I went to Cornell with that in mind and majored in chemistry. And I'd only, as the 4 years went by, I began to think this really isn't what I want to do. And I had a couple of close friends who both were headed for medical school, and the more they talked about it, the better it sounded to me. So about halfway through my junior year, I decided I'm not going to be a chemist, I'm going to be a doctor, and that's how it happened. In the family, we'd only had one medical person, and that was my aunt, my mother's sister, who was a nurse. She was a nurse in Bronxville, outside New York. As a young nurse, she did private nursing, and then she enlisted in the Army during World War II and was overseas in North Africa and in Italy. And later on, she after coming home, she didn't do any sustained nursing after that, but she did do public health nursing for a while. That is, she didn't do any private nursing after that, but she did do public health nursing. So that's the location of where we were. I spent a couple of summers in medical school and before medical school working locally. And one year I worked at the experimental station of the DuPont company, where my father was still working at the time. DuPont was a big name, of course, in Delaware, and still is. Was there another part to that question?
Well, that just, that's interesting, to talk about that, and then anything else that you wanted to talk about just regarding your family. I'm kind of interested in whether or not there was, if it was a parent or a colleague, or who did you find to be a mentor in your life, somebody that may have inspired you in any way, not necessarily
Well,
medical.
I can't honestly, I thought about that because you'd asked that in the written material. I can't think of any one person who was truly a mentor. As I mentioned earlier, Dr. Ramlow was a model physician to me when I came here, and when I was uncertain about some area of behavior and medical behavior and professionally, I would think, well, I wonder what Bob would think about it. I guess that's as close to being a mentor as I would have had.
Talk a little bit about Dr. Ramlow.
Well, he was fiercely devoted to his patients, and he was tenacious. He made it a point to always be well informed, and he had a strong social conscience. And he guarded his patients' privacy at a time when not everyone did that. I could see around me, and that's one of the first things that I remember kind of thinking about. What would Bob do when the newspaper calls and wants to know something about a patient? And I realized that he would not have just divulged information without thinking further about it or finding out whether it fitted or whether that was suitable. His patients were exceptionally loyal to him and grateful to him. Whenever I had a chance to learn that, after he retired, I had some patients of his come my way, and that was obvious, more so than with most other physicians. I also worked closely with him in a group that I'll talk a little about, called Physicians for Social Responsibility. He was one of the steering committee, one of the original founders of our La Crosse chapter, and so he was a regular attend. He was a faithful attender of the steering committee meetings and other activities. He was a stalwart, and so we thought well of each other, I believe. I think he always realized I was sort of a junior figure to him. He didn't treat me in a junior way, but I could sense that he would wonder if I needed to be reminded of something. And after he left rather recently, 3 or 4 years ago, after he left a breakfast discussion group in La Crosse, he asked me to be his follow-up, that is, to take his place, so to speak. He couldn't really take his place, but to fill the chair that he used to sit in at the breakfast meeting. It's a once-a-month meeting of various local people who get together and talk about whatever one talks about when it's his turn to do so. So I thought very highly of Bob. I thought highly of my other colleagues too. I've mentioned already Ed Miner and Bob Green, and of course Al Braley. Jim Glasser and Bill Agar come in for similar commendation. And throughout my whole experience here, it was a rarity to find someone that I couldn't share patient confidence and interest in. I've been, I think, exceptionally blessed with good colleagues throughout. Maybe I should say a few things. Before I leave, I just have a couple of quotes. I'm not even sure I should do more than just allude to them, but they're quotes, medical quotes they're cliches. Everybody's heard them, but I guess they become cliches because they're quoted so much, and they're quoted so much because they're so true. And one of them that I liked is, it's often a quote, often attributed to Hippocrates, but it's an old Greek aphorism, and nobody really knows who said it. Probably many did, and certainly Hippocrates did in alluding to it. But it's familiar. It goes, "Life is short, the art long, the crisis the crisis fleeting, experience perilous, and decision difficult." And that's the part that you hear most often. And it's kind of reassuring to realize that if you're faced with a tense moment, that you're not the only person that's ever been there before. But there's also a second part that doesn't get quoted as much, and that is, the physician must not only be prepared to do what is right himself, but also to make the patient, the attendants, and externals cooperate. And that second part seems to make it clear there are really no limits to one's responsibility for a patient's well-being. The other one that's, again, well-known, it's a cliche, it's the end of an address that Francis W. Peabody gave to Harvard students in October of 1925. And it reads, or it goes, "For the secret of the care of the patient is in caring for the patient." And that's been quoted many times. I read it to mean that unless one shares a patient's feelings, you won't understand the context of the illness, and that will interfere with treatment, even though if you get the right diagnosis. There's one final thing. If I've asked for advice, I would say there are two things. When you hear things aren't going well with the patient, resist the impulse to go to the laboratory or the X-ray or the library. Go to the patient. The other is, when you're puzzled, listen to the patient. He's telling you the diagnosis. So I do want to say something about Physicians for Social Responsibility, because it was not only a major undertaking for me as a doctor, but also for many area physicians and some paramedical people as well. I had read a book by Jonathan Schell called The Fate of the Earth in 1982, I believe. And I was so impressed at the mounting danger of nuclear war and the track we were on as a nation that I called a meeting at my own home to see if anyone wanted to join me in trying to set up a chapter of a physician group dedicated to educating the public about all that's involved with the idea of a nuclear war and how it's a loss for everyone. So I called a meeting at my home, and quite a few local colleagues attended, one or two from St. Francis, most from here. And we set that up. We got it accepted by the national organization and began to have regular meetings, invite guest speakers in, had some discussions of our own, make presentations locally. We made some presentations of a particular film, a very, very exciting and warning type of film called The Last Epidemic, which had been produced by National Physicians for Social Responsibility. We got a copy of that, celluloid copy of that, and various members. I showed it a few times to local organizations, and some of our members took it under on their shoulders to show it many, many times. I think of Cam Roberts doing that. I don't know how many times he may have shown it and how far he may have driven to show it out of town. but it attracted lots of attention. Some things just happened by chance. There was a professor from Madison named John Dower, and he's a historian there. His wife's Japanese, and he had lived in Japan. And he had written a fine book about the aftermath of World War II in Japan and the recovery period there, the occupation, I should say. And so he was going to give a talk in town on the art of Hiroshima. And I happened to notice that, and we got in touch with him, and so he addressed our group. And he had a conversation with Cam Gunderson, which moved Cam to, well, I think John Dower originated the idea. He said, you know, there's a ceremony in Japan. It's a religious ceremony, and it's annual. And they float lanterns down a river, I think the Obe River maybe, and that's in honor of ancestors. He said, wouldn't it be something if your group could float something down the Heartland River of the United States, down the Mississippi, in some way regarding peace and the absence of nuclear war? And Cam picked up on that and brought that to us, to the rest of the group at PSR and locally. And long and short, after a couple of years, we sponsored a lantern float down at Riverside Park on August 3rd, 1985, in memory of Hiroshima. And it was very successful, far beyond our best hopes. We had children went down and built these paper lanterns, fashioned them themselves all day. And they had lots of lanterns. Others brought them, had made them at home. And that evening, when it got dark, we floated the lanterns with candles in them out into the river. And they were all cleaned up by canoe downstream later on. And there was singing and a down by the riverside sort of march with the paper lanterns overhead, and lots of attention, lots of ceremony, and quite a bit of funding. I mean, we collected a lot of money for the group, which was very helpful. Anyway, that became the seed. When we described that to our national chapter, and they picked up and publicized it to the other chapters in the United States, many of the other chapters undertook a similar ceremony. There were hundreds. I was amazed later to read in detail how many ceremonies were modeled after ours in the several years that followed that. And it then spread worldwide, and there were hundreds worldwide, all starting from Cam Gunderson's conversation with John Dower and our PSR adoption of his suggestion that we sponsor that. So that, I'm very proud of that, and I'm proud to have been affiliated with the people that made that happen. So that was a big thing. I don't want to stop there, because that spawned locally a second sort of offshoot, or I guess it would be the first offshoot, called the International Peace Lantern Exchange Program, which Dr. Jim Baumgartner, a dermatologist from here, and his wife Peggy, they put their heart and soul into that for a long, long time, every day, all day, I think, in every spare moment. And what they basically did was to reach out and establish contacts with many others in the USSR to create their paper lanterns and to set up an exchange situation, so that it became a multi-pronged affair that they fostered by creating lanterns and exchanging the information and the lanterns, and then going to the USSR and making the contacts personal. It became a major undertaking. So again, PSR sponsored that, so we were very happy with that. I guess I maybe have said enough about PSR, but as you can see, that was a major part of my life for several years. We got organized about 1982, I think it was, and I've tried to avoid naming individual colleagues in general, because I know I'll forget some very hard-working people, but I did mention a couple, and I should mention Dr. Mike Motter, an obstetrician from here, who after a couple of years or so was willing to co-chair the organization with me, and Cam Roberts in the final years took responsibility. So I think I've said probably too much, but
Well, I've
That's
still
all.
got a couple more questions.
Yeah, please.
And then you disbanded in about 95, I think.
Yes, with the end of the nuclear arms race,
Mm-hmm.
our enthusiasm, my own enthusiasm waned, and I just couldn't keep it up in my own drive, and the same thing happened around me.
Mm-hmm.
So we disbanded. Yeah, but the archive, I should mention
Mm-hmm.
here that there is an archive that's created, has been created by the La Crosse Public Library,
Yes.
and it's in their archival system,
Mm-hmm.
and it has a lot of information about our activities and how we ran things and so on. Susan Wester was the editor of our newsletter. I should mention her.
Oh,
She
yeah.
was a pathologist here.
Mm-hmm. And in
She
addition,
did a fine job of editing, and she retired at the top of her game too. So we were sorry to lose her, but she'd done so much for us.
she was a pathologist?
Pathologist.
Because that name is really familiar to me, too.
Sue Wester. I think she'd been in Madison.
She's in Madison?
I think she had been. I don't
Oh,
know where she is now.
okay. Well, in addition to the PSR, you also were quite heavily involved institutionally. You chaired the education committee, both boards,
Right.
both, and
Right.
tell us about some of those experiences, complexities, or memorable moments.
Oh, gee, I don't know that I can come up with a whole lot there. They were, you felt the weight of the decisions being made there. I wish I could come up with something to say. I served both on the hospital board earlier and then on the clinic board later on.
Bylaws.
I'm sorry?
Bylaws.
Bylaws committee, yes. I did help, yes, I chaired that, and we did an exhaustive review of the bylaws and basically rewrote them. I had lots of help there from other members of the staff. Nancy Korn was the staff person, the administration person who helped. She was the secretary, and again, I'm going to stay away from naming names. I know I'll forget important people. But there were so many moments at the boards, that came up, the whole business of the merger, the meeting with boards of trustees, trying to, there was a transition period when the first administrator, Stanley Sims, who was here when I came, when he left, and then the whole business that pointed toward the foundation's eventual merger to become a three-headed institution, and the complexities are sort of daunting. My memory doesn't serve me well enough to say a whole lot about that, I'm afraid.
Okay. I think we covered that. You're a generous donor to the foundation. What motivates your ongoing support?
The foundation?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how generous I am, but it just seems like a normal thing to do. I mean, Gunderson Clinic and the Lutheran Hospital and now Gunderson Health System has been it's been a huge part of my life, and it just seems obvious that I'd contribute something to it. There's no special reason.
Okay.
Yeah.
On a more personal note, what would your colleagues say that you are known for?
I really pondered that. I really have no idea.
Really?
I have no idea. I wonder. I'd like to know, but I don't know what they would think of me. I know some of them would think that I'm too compulsive or too meticulous about some things that don't deserve that. I can remember hearing that I stay too late at night and don't know when to go home. I've heard that, but I don't think that was a general feeling. I did stay later than most. I worked more slowly than most of my colleagues, I think. But I don't know that they've had any particular feeling about that.
What would you like to be known for?
Oh, taking good care of my patients.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't know whether to mention it here, but there's a plaque that I've asked the medical media to take a picture of.
Okay, sure.
And it's a little brass plaque that was given to me by the family of a patient who died, and it's kind of a reminder of more than one thing. A reminder it's nice to be recognized always. I didn't get a lot of that kind of recognition from patients, and I don't know whether I'm an outlier in that, or in the mainstream. I have no idea, but it's nice to be recognized. The thing that sort of interests me there, it wasn't the quality of care that I provided to her. She was a woman who turned up late with a painful metastasis in her spine, and she was, at that time, early on, there was not going to be a lot of treatment for her at best. So I offered her what there was. But she went on to live at home and die, and pain was her problem. So I helped her with that. But the thing that I think the family responded to was that I would sometimes, simply because it was on my way home, I would stop in. So I'd stop in at night, maybe a half dozen or a dozen times over the course of her illness, which was unique. I didn't do that for most patients, but I think that's what they responded to. And it's kind of a reminder, it's not always the expertise you have. Sometimes it's just because you're a friend.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a favorite story about Gunderson? Best or worst day?
No,
Something.
I saw that too. There were some bad days, but I don't particularly want to relive them. There were a few good ones. I guess it's not right at Gunderson, but it's certain. Gunderson was such a base for this PSR. I keep coming back to Physicians for Social Responsibility because, in a sense, it was a Gunderson happening. The people in it were from Gunderson. We met here. I used the copy machines here. It was the leadership, even though it was a political, it had its political liabilities. There were people in the community who thought we were nothing but, dupes of the Russians to be talking about the dangers of nuclear war and trying to educate the people about it. So there were people who opposed our group. Now and then there'd be a letter in the paper. But in spite of that kind of tinge of political, that tinge to what we were doing, and it's a fact that our actual activities were educational, they weren't political. Anyway, the leadership here at the clinic never in the slightest tried to soften or dissuade us or move us away from what we were doing. I don't remember the direct leadership taking any active role. I won't say they didn't, but they certainly didn't take an opposing role in any sense. And I really credit Gunderson for that.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just trying to think of best days, and maybe if I think of one, I'll think about it later.
Okay. Tell us about what's next for you, what you're doing. You have children.
Yes, I have 4 children. One of them is an emergency room doctor at South Prairie, and he lives in Madison. Okay. He's been the chief of the department there, at least in the past, and he may still be. He's my youngest. My oldest is a retired executive from Hewlett-Packard. I have a daughter who's an attorney with a high-powered firm in L.A. with worldwide offices, and I have a son who's an attorney in Sheboygan. He does general law. She does appellate law, and they each like what they're doing.
And do you get to see them often?
Yeah, well, the ones that are in California I see now and then. I've regularly skied with my son who lives in California. Did I say I have a son near San Diego? Mm-hmm. Yeah. My daughter's in LA, my son's near San Diego. So I've regularly skied with him every year, and I've always seen him at least once a year. My daughter, she was just in town not long ago. She sort of drops in. She still has good friends in Madison, so she comes back and we see each other, and she goes to Madison, plays cards all night, plays sheep's heads all night with her Madison friends. But yeah, and then I see my son in Sheboygan. He's close enough that we travel. Each of us travels now and then. And the ones in Madison, they're only 2.5 hours mm-hmm. away, so I see them regularly. We were just down there for a graduation from high school, and I was just out to Ithaca, New York for my granddaughter my Madison granddaughter who graduated from Cornell. Mm-hmm. And we just attended both of those. So yeah, I see the kids with some regularity.
Do you go to the breakfast, or not the breakfast, the lunches that are held at Diggers?
No, I don't go to Diggers. There are 2 lunches.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Do you know that? There's another one?
I don't know. Didn't know that.
Well, they're not exactly in competition, but the Diggers Luncheon, by reputation, is pretty conservative.
Okay.
Our group is pretty liberal. Our group was started by Al Braley and two of the male nurses that worked for him in occupational health and therapy. They began going out to lunch on Fridays years and years and years ago, long before I knew either of them very well. And then at some point along the way, I forget whether it's after I retired or before, maybe after I retired, I began to join them for lunch. And then Dr. Terman began to come to the lunch. Dr. Cam Gunderson was a big part of that group while he was well through the years. Also, Rolf Slungard, who's deceased, he was a part of that group. And now Steve Copps, back from Georgia, is part of the group. He said, I think you've just interviewed him recently. He said he had a great time, by the way.
Good. Yeah.
And so he's part of the group more recently. The two male nurses, Ward Evenson and Bob Busby, we know both of them and their wives, and they've been a part of it right from the beginning with Al. Cam Roberts has just recently joined. I know I'm going to forget somebody. Let's see. Oh, Paul Schoenfeld has just joined very recently. When I say joined, there's no formal joining, and they've just started to attend. So has Dick Reinertson now and then. So there's quite a few. And Denny Ryan, he's a regular. So yes, that's the other group. We meet on Fridays at lunch.
Well, it must be important to Dr. Turman because I've tried to schedule him on a Friday and he won't do it.
Oh, that's right.
I have a standing meeting on Friday.
Well, I thought hard about it.
So, let's see. Anything else that you'd like to share? I think I've kind of covered just about everything I have.
I think you have.
Do you have any recollections of social activities when you first started?
The biggest recollection is the clinic was small enough we could all have a New Year's party at one home. It was the Hayden home down on Cooley Springs Lane. My first recollection of a real social activity here. The other thing is that clinic meetings once a month were much more social. There was an open bar, and it was regularly used, and it was a fun evening, and we'd talk about things and get business done too. Is there any particular form of social activity you're wondering about?
What about Saturday morning breakfasts?
You know, that was mentioned
I think you
today.
talked to Kay.
That was mentioned today at lunch, and I tried, and I just can't remember Saturday morning breakfast.
Has somebody else talked about that?
So who brought it up?
It was, I think it was Steve Copps who brought it up, because he brought it up to us today.
could be-
I just had lunch with Steve Copps and Al Braley. Al couldn't remember it either. Now, he's been here since 1962.
Right.
Because Cops
So-
was 58, wasn't he? Is that when he started?
58?
and 59, somewhere in that range.
Was it that early?
I thought it was that early.
There's an odd kind of, while you're thinking about it, I'll tell you there's a kind of a special form of social activity that was a daily part of the routine here. And it was goof-off time, but it was also important functionally. And you kind of realize that later. But when the clinic was small and the emergency room was nothing more than a corridor leading out to South Avenue, a single corridor with a few rooms, everybody that I sort of think about in those days would head down to the emergency room corridor about 10:30, 10:20, something like that, and have a cup of coffee. And you'd spend about 10 or 15 minutes just having coffee and maybe cookies, John Hayden's cookies. And but at that time, you covered a lot of bases. You talked to people that you needed to talk to. You didn't have to go chasing down around the clinic all day. And it was a very functional time. You talked about the patient you had in common, or a question you had about his specialty, or this or that, and you were able to do that with half a dozen people that you needed to be in touch with. So it's too bad those days don't exist when you're as big as we are.
Mm-hmm.
You see a little of it down in the medical library, but it's too hit or miss down there, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, you're talking about in the professional center.
In the professional center, I do. Yeah.
Yeah, that's used primarily by the same people, and they do visit.
Yeah. You asked if there's anything I'm doing or interested in. I do have a kind of a mental project going. I'm trying to read all the literature I can about an idea I have, and so it has to do with the inner ear and the vestibular system and any possible relationship of music to that. So it it means there's plenty of things that you can go digging about, and I find myself going online to really abstruse articles and chasing things right and left and trying to get to the right article. And Kitty has been very helpful there. She's kind of my go-to person for that. But they're all helpful, you know. Melinda's been supportive,
Yes.
and Anne is always helpful. Yeah.
Yep, they've been there since I was there,
Yeah, I
so
remember.
very dedicated.
Yes, they really are.
Yes.
They're really helpful. I mean, they really go out of their way to help.
Well, thank you so much for coming in today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Good.